It's now time for our second panel, which will explore the faith of the Abraham Accords. I'm pleased to introduce as moderator Merissa Khurma, Director of the Middle East Program at the Wilson Center. Merissa was previously a non-resident fellow in the International Security Program at New America. She has leadership experience working in a range of developmental projects in the Middle East that focused on economic development, the Syrian refugee crisis, education, youth, gender development, and governance. Merissa previously serves as director of the Office of Jordan's Prince Ali bin al-Hussein and as press attaché and director of the Information Bureau at the Embassy of Jordan in Washington, D.C. She has a Master of Public Administration from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and a Master of Science in International Security and Foreign Policy from Georgetown University. I'll turn the discussion over now to Merissa Khurma, who will introduce the panel speakers, facilitate the discussion, and lead the Q&A session that follows. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Jim, for the very kind introduction, and thanks again to General McKenzie and the team at GNSI for bringing all of us together to discuss the recent developments in the region, but also the path towards perhaps an imagined peace or the envisioned peace for the region. I'm truly delighted to be moderating this discussion today with experts from the region and on the region who have spent time across the Middle East and North Africa, who have studied the region and have published very prolifically about the topics that we will be discussing today. So Ambassador Gerald Feierstein, former U.S. Ambassador to Yemen and now Distinguished Fellow at the Middle East Institute, Shai Feldman, who is Professor of Israeli Politics at Brandeis University, and last but not least, Dalia Kaye, who is Director of the Initiative for Regional Security Architectures at UCLA, but also a former fellow at the Wilson Center. As we've heard today from General McKenzie in the morning and from our colleagues on the previous panel, which I think did a wonderful job to set the stage for this discussion on the Abraham Accords, the region is at an inflection point. And the third-year commemoration of the Abraham Accords was just about 2 weeks ago. There were no celebrations, there were no commemorative events, because this basically happened as the war in Gaza continues. And as of a few days ago, a very significant escalation between Hezbollah and Israel in Lebanon. We've seen a lot of human suffering across the past 11 plus months since the horrific attacks of October 7th, the war in Gaza, but also now as we see more innocent casualties in Lebanon. But we've also heard from Ambassador Abdullah bin al-Khalifa about how the Abraham Accords could also be a conduit towards resolving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and asking the question of what does it take to return to that path. So before we delve into the various questions, and I do want to get back to the Bahrain or the Manama Declaration that he talked about, I want to start with a very general question. Where are we today with the Abraham Accords? I'll start with you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Merissa, and thank you also to the GNSI Center for inviting us and organizing this conference. What I would say is that the positive news about the Abraham Accords is that they're still there, and that the events since October 7th have not led any of the parties to withdraw or to cease their contacts with the government of Israel as a result. And so I think that is something that makes the Abraham Accords something that can be built on for the future. But there was a kind of a conceit about the organization of the Abraham Accords that I think events since October 7th have demonstrated were not exactly correct. And that is, there was an expectation or an understanding here in the United States, as well as perhaps in the region, that the Abraham Accords demonstrated that the region was ready to move forward with integration with Israel without making any kind of resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict a predicate for that. And I think that what we've seen since October 7th is that while that may be true for the governments that signed the Abraham Accords, it's not true for the general populations. And what we've seen since last October is that the governments, because of the strong popular reaction to particularly Israeli military operations in Gaza, they have been unable to move beyond where they were in the implementation of the Abraham Accords prior to October 7th. So what we have right now is a frozen situation. The Abraham Accords are still there. The relationship and the contact with the government of Israel is still there, but we're not going to see anything beyond that until there is some forward progress with the Palestinian issue that allows the populations to be more responsive and more supportive of what they're going to do. At that point, I think the Accords, and I should make the point that when we're talking about the Abraham Accords in this context, fundamentally we're talking about the Accords as they apply to the GCC countries. Although Morocco and to a certain extent Sudan were also signers of the Accords, they're not really relevant to this particular conversation. But in terms of Bahrain, of UAE especially, and potentially of Saudi Arabia, it does put them in a position where they can play a very important role going forward.
And of course, what you mentioned earlier as the Abraham Accords shifting the dynamics is what the Arab Peace Initiative introduced
That's exactly
in
right.
2002.
In other words, the Arab Peace Initiative, the API, which was introduced by the late King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia in 2002, did say that the predicate for normalization among Arab League states with Israel was, in fact, a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the establishment of an independent Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. What the Abraham Accords has done is they've set that aside, but the important thing, and again, I think it's a reflection of where popular sentiment is in the region today, both the government of UAE and the government of Saudi Arabia have now said that any forward movement on normalization with Israel is now explicitly related once again to either the establishment of an independent Palestinian state or irreversible steps towards the establishment. So in fact, what we've done is that although the Abraham Accords still exist, the API is once again the relevant document that's going to determine how we go forward.
And that is what Sheikh Abdullah was referencing with the Manama Declaration. Shai, I want to turn to you to give the view, particularly from Israel, on where we are with the Abraham Accords.
Well, first of all, thank you all for inviting me, and thank you, General Mackenzie, for having me back. I understand that we are being tested to have a session on the wonderful, uplifting Middle East right after lunch. We'll try to see if we can survive. This. I'm going to actually try to connect what I wanted to say, because I completely agree with everything that Ambassador Feierstein said. I will try to connect also what I want to say to the previous session, the previous panel, and also to the challenge that the Ambassador of Bahrain put in front of us, which is where do we go from here? How do we actually, in a sense, leverage that was good in the Abraham Accords for trying to resolve the conflict. I understand why everyone is very depressed about the situation in the Middle East, but I just want to remind all of us that the most horrific chapter in European history, which is the Second World War, and in parentheses the Holocaust, led to the creation of the European Union, to the creation of NATO, to essentially 76 years of peace in Europe until Putin decided to invade Ukraine. So the fact that we are not in a very uplifting situation in the Middle East I don't think that should prevent us from looking how to change. And I think the building blocks are there. Let me first, before getting to the good news, let me just re-emphasize a point that Ambassador Feildstein made. If you study the history of Israeli-Palestinian relations in the context of the broader Middle East, what you will see is that every time that the Arab world tended to walk away from the Palestinian issue, what we had was an explosion. The first explosion was in the 1980s when King Hussein of Jordan announced the disengagement, basically, of the Hashemite kingdom from the West Bank. Actually, during the same time, there was an Arab League meeting, the first time of a summit of the Arab League where the concluding statement didn't even mention the Palestinians. And the result was the first Palestinian Intifada. The result was the Palestinians basically said, you don't take care of us, we'll have to take care of ourselves. A similar thing happened after July 2000. Camp David, with all the efforts of the Clinton administration, failed. And what the Palestinians understood as President Clinton's violation of the promise that he had made, presumably to Chairman Arafat, that there will be no finger pointing, whatever the outcome of Camp David would be, went on and held a press conference in which he basically accused Arafat of being responsible for the failure of Camp David. And guess what? The result was the second Palestinian Intifada. And now we have the third chapter is the Abraham Accords. And we have to remember, in the Palestinian discourse, the Palestinian narrative, the Abraham Accords constituted a sense of betrayal because it violated, again, the conditionality that was in the Arab Peace Initiative that connected the issue of peace with Israel to at least progress in resolving the Israeli-Palestinian. I'm not saying that because of the Abraham Accords, Hamas attacked Israel, but I would say this, that because of the Abraham Accords and the notion that it was, in a sense, perceived by the Palestinians and some Arabs as betrayal, it at least gave the Iranians a talking point to say, we have a case, okay, go with it. Of course, for Iranian interests, but the narrative was in place. So I think that whatever happens now, if we are looking for, as Ambassador Feildstein said, if we're looking for a way forward which is positive, that requires a correction. That lack of immediate causal relationship between the two issues, let's say the regional framework and Israeli-Palestinian peace has to be amended. Now, why am I hopeful? The reason I'm hopeful is because I belong at least to, let's say, that part of the Israeli domestic scene that does believe strongly that there is no end to this conflict without resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which means without essentially at least paving the path to Palestinian independence of some sort. That's not inconsistent with at least one of the two candidates running for president of the United States, right? Who talked about Israel's right to defend itself, but also said, but we have to think about what does it mean for the Palestinians, and we have to support their quest for self-determination. And I think this is correct. These are the three elements that we're talking about. Now, the problem with getting forward here is that right now, Israel is now shifting, of course, from Gaza to the north. We can get into that. I won't get into that right now, but probably in the discussion we'll get there. But Israel has still not completed the campaign in the south. And the south is Hamas. And for us, what happened, for Israelis, what happened on October 7 of last year is Israel's 9/11. And at least Hamas, as we knew it, is not a partner for resolving the conflict. So the key here, and that doesn't, and again, I also agree, there is no military solution to this, okay? There is no solution other than to find, and it's first and foremost the Palestinians' responsibility to find a replacement for Hamas. In my view, the only replacement is the PLO and the PA, the Palestinian Authority, because Israel signed the Oslo Accords, and with the Palestinian Authority. Hamas took over Gaza violently in 2007. That situation has to be returned to the pre-takeover of Hamas, of Gaza by Hamas. Now, the problem, of course, is as the Biden administration itself recognizes, the PA, as it is configured right now, is not in a position to replace Hamas. It has to be reinvigorated, it has to be reinvented, it has to do a lot of things. This is where the countries that have essentially pioneered the peace with Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and at least three, I think, actually, I do include Morocco, because Morocco, by the way, by the Arab League, has the Jerusalem portfolio. Mm-hmm. It's a significant player in the region, but we have a core of 5 countries here who, if they are orchestrated together, can play a role in invigorating the Palestinian Authority. Now, it's true, if you ask me today, at this hour, before the tornado comes, is the Israeli government right now supportive of this? And I would say the government, no. But if you ask me where is Israel's defense community is, I would say definitely yes. To go back to the last session, the fact that the Prime Minister of Israel today, the issue is not he's not looking for an exit ramp. But the Israeli defense community certainly does. The Chief of Staff certainly does. The head of the Mossad certainly does. The head of the Shabak certainly does. They have been the ones who were conversing with their American and Egyptian and Jordanian counterparts about where do we go from here. Mm-hmm. So I think the fact that right now the stars don't seem to be aligned in the right place right now should not dissuade us from thinking creatively about how to move from here to there.
Thank you so much, Shai. And yes, we will get into all the other topics at a later point. Dalia, how do you see things?
Okay, well, I'll stick mostly to the Abraham Accords, though Shai raised a lot of other issues I'm sure we'll get into. And I would just say that, Shai, if we had in Israel today with leaders thinking like you think, we would be in a lot different position. But that is unfortunately not where we are. Thank you again to General McKenzie and GNSI for the great organizing despite this hurricane. I think it's a hurricane, not a tornado, but either way, it's an apt metaphor for the topic we're discussing, despite Shai's optimism.
For Middle Easterners, they're the same.
They're the same, right. So, I think in terms of where we are, I want to pick up on, I also agree with both comments already. I want to pick up on the ambassador's point on what's positive, which is, the accords are still there. I think we need, though, to ask ourselves, why are they still there? And so let's go back a little bit and understand why these accords emerged to begin with. And then I think I want to propose that we need to also, if we want to think about a path forward, we need to start being realistic about our expectations, about what led to these and what could lead to more progress moving forward. I think what's really key here is that this was driven by national interest. This isn't, as any agreement usually is, this was not kind of an altruistic gift. It was driven by national interest, primarily transactional deals, yes, bilateral with Israel, but really about these countries' relationships with Washington. You notice the ambassador had a good amount to say about the very robust bilateral relationship, defense relationship in particular, given our important base in Bahrain and our naval assets there, and they do play an important role. And these are not countries that were at war with Israel. These are countries, these particularly Gulf countries, and Morocco for that matter. I think Lucy in the earlier panel talked about the Madrid peace process, the multilateral peace process. In the 90s, we had Israeli foreign ministers, huge delegations going to Oman, going to Bahrain. You know, this is not transformational stuff. We've been seeing this for decades. These countries had normal, not formal diplomatic relations, but normal relations with Israel. This was not earth-shattering. What it was is they wanted to hedge, the Emiratis in particular, with the next administration coming in. This was at the end of the Trump administration. This is a bipartisan issue that's supported, as it should be. Normalization is a good thing, right? We want diplomatic relations between countries of the Middle East. We don't want war. We'd rather have diplomatic deals than missiles flying in the region, which is where we are today. So it's a good thing in principle, but we have to remember it was driven by transactional narrow interest. And this is not an outlier in how peace deals come about in the Middle East. This is what Egypt did, this is what Jordan did. And as a result, the Palestinian issue, as Shai rightly noted, was again marginalized. They were sidelined, they were ignored. Yes, the first agreement was to suspend Israeli annexation. Let's not forget, in the summer of 2020, real worries about the Israeli government annexing the territory formally in the West Bank. They suspended it for the time being, but look at the government we have now. We'll get more into that later. So this is, I think, important to right-size what these deals were about. And I think one of my concerns is there's very unrealistic expectations about what these deals were supposed to accomplish. On regional integration, this idea that these bilateral transactional, yes, it was fostering regional cooperation, which we should, that's all good. But let's not, fool ourselves. This is not gonna be a regional economically integrated Middle East. Yes, there's gonna be growing trade. Israel is an energy exporter. This is very important, especially in the water sphere. My former colleague at RAND, Howard Schatz, knows all about these things. But the region's future economically lies in the East. Trade with China, trade with India, this idea that we're going to lock the Middle East and that's going to be peace. And on the military front, and I would push back a little on the earlier panel, yes, there was a regional response to the missiles flying at Israel, unprecedented Iranian attack in April on Israeli soil, directly from Iran. But I don't think we should have high expectations that we're about on the cusp of a Middle East NATO, where these Arab countries normalized with Israel are going to create a defense pact. This was, again, driven by relations with Washington. Jordan, yes, militarily was engaged, but made it very clear it was doing so out of its own national interest to protect its own sovereignty. And the other Gulf powers who probably played an indirect intelligence and other supporting role also did so for their own interest, because regional instability is not in their interest. They did not want to see a regional war. So this is, I think, and it was pointed out on the earlier panel rightly, that these countries, the Emiratis, even, probably most the Emiratis, lesser the Bahrainis, have made it very clear that they don't see these pacts and this normalization with Israel as anti. This is kind of a narrative that's taken hold in Washington, and rightly, I think the earlier panel pointed out, this is not zero-sum, this is not either or. All of these players who are who have normalized relations with Israel have actually been normalizing with Iran. We've seen more normalization with Iran this last year than we have with Israel, frankly. They want to have relations on all sides. They don't want to be in Iran's crosshairs. They also have relations with China, Russia, and the US. So this is this is the reality we're dealing with. And then finally, I would just say the unrealistic expectations about delivering peace. Yes, diplomatic relations are good. Regional cooperation is good. This is not peace. We need to define our terms here. Mm-hmm. These countries were not at war. If we want peace in the Middle East, if we want a pathway forward, we need to reconcile the differences between the countries and actors currently at war. And those are fundamentally, the Israelis and the Palestinians have to figure out how to share that piece of land, because there's no getting around it. No amount of normalization deals are going to replace that. And ultimately, we're going to have to find some kind of accommodation, assuming Iran and definitely Israel's not going anywhere, So how are we going to have an accommodation between Iran and Israel? Until we figure those things out, there's no path forward.
Thank you so much, Dalia. I want to pick up on a running theme in your comments, but particularly the last one on unrealistic expectations with regards to peace. Because Ambassador Feierstein mentioned in the beginning that these agreements also were done between governments, did not necessarily reflect public opinion, which we have seen shift tremendously against normalization since the horrific attacks, October 7th, and the war in Gaza. And how do we move forward from there? Because these governments, these countries are not democracies, but they are not immune to pressures from within. And there's a whole generation of young people, and just a reminder to the audience that the Middle East and North Africa region is a very young region. More than 50% are under the age of 30. How do we move forward when there's a whole generation that for the first time are watching this war live on TikTok and other social media channels, and there's a lot of hatred also being nurtured on a daily basis? So where do we go from there? And that includes both Arab society, but also Israeli society that is traumatized by the attacks of October 7th.
Well, I think that it's a very good question, and I think it goes back to that fundamental point that we started at, which is where do you go from here? And the idea that in order to make these Abraham Accords sustainable over time, you need to deepen the roots. I think that there was expectations that if once the Abraham Accords were signed, that there was going to be travel back and forth, there was going to be a lot more business activity. The one country that has been most able to take advantage of the Abraham Accords, and I agree with Dalia on this point, and clearly the country that's been most able to advance because of the Accords is the UAE, because the UAE in most economic ways was the most comparable to Israel and had the best ability to use the ties, but it didn't go beyond really the business community. In fact, if you look at the agreements that were signed between Emirati and Israeli businesses post-Abraham Accords, you see that in fact most of the Emirati companies were parastatals. It was not really the private sector that was engaged. It was governmental entities that were signing these agreements. So I think it comes back to the point that I think Shai and Dalia also touched on, and that is that in order to promote deeper political and social relations, you need to use the Abraham Accords in order to accomplish the broader mission of promoting peaceful resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That is the issue that is of greatest concern to the street right now, whether you're talking about Abu Dhabi or Riyadh or anywhere else in the region. And that is the place where you have the greatest potential, really, I think, for the Abraham Accords countries, signatories, to actually exercise their influence with both Israelis and Palestinians to try to advance a goal. We talked a little bit about the role of the United States, and I think the first panel did as well, the role of the United States since the signing of Oslo in 1993, 1994, where the U.S. Arrogated to itself the role of the sole mediator between Israelis and Palestinians. And the reality, if we look at it in all honesty, is that the U.S. failed tremendously in doing it because of foreign policy, but also because of domestic policy reasons, that the U.S. proved that it was incapable, really, of playing honest broker role between Israelis and Palestinians. Therefore, there's a requirement for broadening out the negotiations to include some of these other states. And I would say that UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, I agree with Shai, Morocco, in that context is an important player, to have them also at the table, to do a better job of trying to support Palestinians and to even the negotiating table, if you will, so that you have a better opportunity to actually achieve a peaceful resolution. And by doing that, I think, then you can also demonstrate to the publics, to the young people in these societies, that in fact the Abraham Accords is accomplishing what they wanted to accomplish. But as long as it is merely a transactional approach which allows businesses and allows governments to cooperate, and I agree, I think Dalia made an important point, we should be very clear that these were all governments that had de facto relationships with Israel well before the Abraham Accords was signed. All the Abraham Accords accomplished was that it made de facto relationships de jure. And that is the difference between them. And that's why the street doesn't really see that their interests and their concerns have been addressed by the Accords.
Thank you, Jerry. Shai, would you comment on how Israeli society
Can you hear me?
sees? Yeah.
So I just want to make a few short comments about what was said. In the service of making this a little more interesting so we don't all agree about everything on this panel. I don't know what people expected from the Abraham Accords. I don't think we should focus on that because people persuade themselves that the best case scenario will take place, and without them having to invest or pay for that. It happens all the time. I'm not too excited about that. Secondly, I'm not sure that to say, well, these states were simply following their national interest is really a critique. I think that if they signed the Abraham Accords, and whatever they did out of the Abraham Accords because they calculated that it was in their national interest, that's a very good story. Secondly, to say that they follow their national interest, okay, Arab states follow their national interest, or their perception of what their national interests were, when they decided to invade Palestine in 1948, when Egypt crossed the Suez Canal in 1973. So the issue really is, okay, hopefully governments follow their assessment or analysis of what their national interest is. The question is, are we facing an era in the Middle East in which people calculate differently their national interest? And in my view, the answer is yes. In my view, the relative weight of geopolitics compared to geoeconomics has shifted. And the Abraham Accords is part of a larger shift in the Middle East where people say power is important, but prosperity is also important. And it's not just the Abraham Accords, it's the East Mediterranean Energy Forum, in which Israel is there, and Jordan is there, and Egypt is there, of course, and Cyprus, and so on and so forth. We have a Northern Red Sea, now cooperative forum. What's that about? And so on and so forth. So we have a number of different indications of what's going on. Now, the most dramatic, you could say, to some extent, the least important, but in my view, the most dramatic, which people forgot about because of the last 11 months, is that 2 years ago, Israel and the so-called state of Lebanon, I would say the reality is Israel signed with Hezbollah, okay, not formally, Israel signed with Hezbollah an agreement on the demarcation of the economic boundaries between Israel and Lebanon, okay? That agreement will never, yes, okay, so they deferred to Nabil Berri, the Speaker of the Parliament, to do the actual negotiations. We all know who the negotiation side on the other. What was that about? That was about the fact that Nasrallah calculated at the time that the economic situation in Lebanon, okay, makes the ability to extract the natural gas in the Mediterranean an absolute necessity for Lebanon. And he okayed the agreement with Israel on demarking the boundaries between. What's that about? That's about the fact that even Nasrallah understands that there is something called geoeconomics. And this is an important shift that has taken place. I also don't think that nothing of the Abraham Accords translated to people peace, because the reality is that there is changes in the textbooks of elementary school and high school, in the UAE particularly. So now, let's say that what I said now is completely untrue, and that all that we had gained from this is the hope that nobody is shooting each other. Well, I'm just thinking about myself, okay, now Israel has 45 years of peace with Egypt, in which, with tiny skirmishes around the border, Egyptians didn't shoot Israelis and Israelis didn't shoot Egyptians. And when the Egyptians had a big problem in the northwestern part of the Sinai, dealing with the Al-Qaeda, ISIS-associated guys, okay? And they asked Israel for permission to violate or to go beyond the security protocols of the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty in terms of what forces they are allowed to deploy. Israel green-lighted essentially the dramatic violation in terms of the numbers and the kinds of forces Egypt was allowed to deploy so that they can deal. Of course, what was that? Was that philanthropy? No, it was Israel doing its national interest, that Egypt would be stabilized by taking care of the terrorism attack, the terrorism challenge. I don't see any minuses in any of this. I think all I see is pluses. Otherwise, those packages you all got when you registered, you would have to expect some Prozac in the packages.
Well, but thank you for injecting the hope.
Yes.
Go
Yes,
ahead, Dalia.
absolutely. Well, Shai, I'm sorry if you misunderstood. When I was saying, I was explaining why they are surviving. They're surviving because, like all other accords, including Israel-Egypt, it is driven by national interest. And the reason, it wasn't a critique, it was an explanation. And the reason I think it's important about the issue of realistic expectations and actually grounding policies based on the realities of the region and not your wishes is that priorities matter, because this expectation that this was going to unlock everything in the region has led the U.S. president to invest and his highest national security advisors over 2 years in an Israeli-Saudi peace deal that was never based on, it was completely based on wishful thinking. And even if you think it was a good idea, maybe it was, we didn't ask the question of how high of a price the U.S. was going to pay for that. But needless to say, many people, including Saudis that I would talk to on occasion, never quite understood our obsession with it, because they always kept insisting we would need, and this is before October 7th, we would need to see something serious on the Palestinian front.
Issue, yes.
So that is where the downside is. It's in terms of where are you investing your time, and where did we not invest our time? We did not invest our time in what is now currently engulfing the entire region, the entire world, and could threaten U.S. national security. So I think it is a big deal. But just, Merissa, to get to your point on the people part, I think it is good. All of these economic deals and so forth are important. They didn't trickle down. The people absolutely very important, but did not trickle down in the way that you would want. Now I think it's something to work for, and that's something that can be rebuilt. Mm-hmm. But also I think we have to understand that for young people in the region, I think this was another unrealistic expectation, that the region moved on, leaders moved on. Right, we have a real disconnect. Some leaders moved on because they had other pressing national interest: economic development, diversification, wanting to lock in certain security deals with Washington. But the Palestinian issue still resonates at a societal level so deeply, and it is just something that we ignore to our detriment. And so I think to really get young people in the next generation invested in this in a positive way, they need to do things like read Shai's book and all of the peacemaking efforts and his positive way forward. and to start socializing a new generation to see something different, because all they've seen now is continued occupation, continued military incursions, and continued loss of life and killing. So I think that's something. But I want to say one last thing is in defense of top-down, which I don't usually do, but actually I think, and just to get a little more in the positive, I think one thing we can do moving forward is we can leverage the fact that we have leaders in this region now. Yes, not perfect, authoritarian and so forth, but they don't want war with Israel, right? And they don't want regional war. They want stability. And that's the majority consensus right now, across the board, even among Arab states that have rivalries with each other. And that is something that can be leveraged. And the fact that these leaders also are normalizing with Iran, and they have normalized relationships with Israel, is something that also could be better leveraged moving forward. So I think that there is that, if I want to find some hope in the top down and not just the negative, I think that's something that maybe we should think about working with.
And a great segue to the Iran factor in the region from the perspective of particularly the Arab states. And Shai, I would like to hear how you see it from an Israeli lens as well. Because the vast majority of people see what's happening in Gaza and Lebanon through the prism of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or the Arab-Israeli conflict. More with Hezbollah, the Iran factor. How is this playing out? How is the Iran factor playing out in the minds of the leadership, but also how is it being perceived amongst the public? I'm asking all of you, but if you want to go first, Shai, just to mix it up a bit.
I don't look. There are issues in the let's call it the national political and security agenda, where people's attitude is very important. You can't ignore. It reminds me of one time when I was asked about a certain audience. Don't take it personal. That I was asked to address, and I said, "Can you tell me something about the audience?" And they said to me, "They don't know much, but they have strong opinions." So there are issues where the public doesn't need to know much, but it can have strong opinions because it has to do with the issue, what the basic values are, how they feel about the future of the state of Israel, and so on and so forth. So regarding the future relations with the Palestinians, because of the importance of East of Jerusalem and the West Bank, people's opinions are very, very important. I actually think that on the Iran issue, the public doesn't play. The Iran issue is really an issue of the national security establishment of Israel to deal with. Of course, there are variations. Of course, there were disagreements. Of course, not everybody agreed, again, with Prime Minister Netanyahu when he went to the UN, and particularly when he went to address the joint session of Congress and appeal directly, let's call it, to the American people above the head of the president at the time, President Obama. So there have been disagreements, serious disagreements about how to deal with the Iran issue. But these are disagreements within the defense community, between the former heads of the Mossad and the heads of the and IDF chiefs of staff and so on and so forth. So I don't think the public really plays here. The problem is that we have a problem. The problem is that, and I also agree that the rhetoric in Iran has changed. It's not the rhetoric of 40 years ago. I completely agree. But the reality is that on the other side Iran has not gone through the whole transformation that Arab countries around Israel have gone through. It's still, first of all, it still regards Israel as an adversary. And by the way, there is a lot of mirror imaging. I happened to have once been in a session with an Iranian leader who talked about their threat perception. And it sounded as if one of my colleagues was talking about the Israeli, Iran, and so on and so forth. I don't think that the Israelis completely buy this idea that this is purely a peace program. Okay, they don't need for a peace program 60% enrichment, 90% enrichment, and so on and so forth. At the very least, I think the Israeli assessment is, and by the way, it's not different from what General Milley told the U.S. Congress. What did he say? Number one, it's a threshold state. Number two, they can get the adequate quantities of fissile material within weeks or months. And yes, he said it would take up to 2 years to weaponize and so on. Well, 2 years for people who existed 2,000 years, 2 years is not really, it's basically like the sunset clauses of the JCPOA. It's tomorrow morning, right? So nobody has come up right now, until now, with any solution to this problem. Just like, by the way, going back to the discussion in the last session of getting out of the Lebanese quagmire. Because it's very nice to say, beware, and I agree, that Israel has to be aware of finding itself in the same situation that it found itself after 1982, where it spent 18 years trying to extract itself from Lebanon. By the way, completely different from 2006, because 2006 was ended by a UN Security Council resolution, 1701. Correct. The Israeli objective, by the way, which is, again, why the Northern Front is so different from the Southern Front, because in the Southern Front, the Israeli government has still not defined what its realistic objectives are. In the North, and by the way, there is a complete disagreement at the top echelons of Israel about what this is about in Gaza, if not just prolonging the war because of what domestic political considerations that Prime Minister Netanyahu has. This is very different from the North, because the issue in the North enjoys national consensus. No Israeli will accept anything other than a situation in which the conditions that would allow the 80,000 Israelis to go back to their homes. Because remember, this is as if Buffalo, New York was attacked from the Canadian border, okay, and America sustained something equivalent to 9/11 in Buffalo, New York. Well, how would you expect the population in Buffalo, New York to go back to their homes if there is no solution to the security problem, the security challenges? So this is a problem so just to say, well, Israel, yes, it is exercising. It's walking a very, very fine line, which is difficult to walk, and you can see the consequences. It's not easy, and it's sliding in the wrong direction. But because it has no other solution until now, it's exercising essentially escalation dominance. And what is Nasrallah doing? Also escalation dominance. Israel doesn't want a full-scale war. Iran doesn't want a full-scale war, because a full-scale war means that stockpile that Iran built in Lebanon to deter Israel from attacking its nuclear installations will be vulnerable to the Israeli Air Force. We know how that can end. So the Iranians are not interested. Nasrallah is probably not interested. Israel is probably not interested. Okay, but they're all finding themselves in a spiral because there's no parachute.
And we've heard the previous panel talk about how that creates a lot of space for miscalculations and missteps that could also spiral out of control. But
by the way, it's not that this can cause it. This is happening every day.
I want to go back to the Iran factor with regards to the Arab world in particular, the GCC. This is a region you know very well, Ambassador. They chose to normalize.
That's right.
The Saudi foreign minister was just in a meeting with the Iranian foreign minister yesterday in New York. And how can this be leveraged, going back to Dalia's point?
Well, I think, first of all, and I think that this is an important point because it goes directly to calculations that are being made in the GCC, and that is that we shouldn't look at the Abraham Accords as sui generis. In other words, it was not only the relationship with Israel and a desire to normalize relations with Israel that was driving Emirati or Bahraini calculations in 2020. They had begun, and the Saudis as well, had begun discussions with Tehran even before the Abraham Accords. The Emiratis in the lead had taken important steps towards normalization. The Saudis opened a dialogue with Tehran. Somebody in the earlier panel had said that it was really Chinese mediation. This caught everyone by surprise. Well, in fact, it was not Chinese mediation. The deal that was agreed to in Beijing was on the table for several years, just waiting for the two sides to pick it up. And the fact that they decided to pick it up in Beijing had more to do with their mutual desire to appease or to appeal to China than it did that the Chinese actually broke through. So basically, I think that the issue that drives normalization with Israel, that drives the Abraham Accords, is the same reason that they were driving normalization with Tehran, and that is that a calculation was made by the GCC states 2019, 2020, that in terms of their own national interest, what they needed to do was to reduce tension in the region, to turn towards political and diplomatic solutions to regional problems, and to be able to reduce their defense budgets and focus their attention on the things that were really important to them and that they believed were essential for state stability. And that was domestic, political, economic, and social issues. They needed to address their growing demographic bulge, to find jobs for young men and young women coming into the labor force. They needed to find ways to diversify their economies, to introduce high tech and other kinds of initiatives into their societies, and they couldn't do that while they were so heavily focused on these threats. And agreeing with the basic point that they never really saw Israel, or had not seen for decades Israel, as a serious strategic threat, but nevertheless it was out there in an adversarial relationship, kind of. And the same thing with Iran. We see it the same way in terms of Saudi negotiations with the Houthis that were proceeding until October 7th to get Saudi Arabia out of that conflict. And so everything that we're seeing in the region over the last 4 or 5 years has really been a focus on conflict resolution, on reducing regional tensions, on allowing societies to move forward on economic issues and other issues that are of greater concern to them. And how can you leverage it, to go back to your question? I think that the way you leverage it is to for our part, we should be encouraging this. We should be trying to find ways that help these states accomplish this, and also, to the extent that we can contribute to it, we should also be focusing on reducing tensions, and that means, in this particular instance, it means, in my view, thinking about how you move forward from this terrible situation we're in with Gaza and the northern border, and get some kind of dialogue going that would aim at resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, aimed at resolving the Israel-Lebanon issue, and perhaps bringing Iran into some kind of a more positive conversation about the region and everybody's interest.
And Dalia, how do you leverage that? Does the United States support ongoing efforts do they use these channels to talk to Iran?
Well, I think it's been pretty clear that they already have been. This administration has already been engaging in de-escalation with the Iranians before October 7th, since October 7th, through our Gulf partners. And that has been helpful, I think, in preventing possible escalation. But I think, something Shai mentioned was very important, the distinction between the southern front and the northern front for Israelis in terms of the consensus, because there's so much strife in Israel about how to deal with Gaza and the hostages and the priority and protest and so forth. But when it comes to the north, polling consistently, you're right, Iran is not as much of a popular issue, but polling does show in terms of the support for the second front against Hezbollah, support against Iran, tremendous consensus in Israel across the political spectrum and the population. And there is understanding that you cannot return, you can't accept this situation where you have a depopulated north. So it's very clear. I think, the distinction with Washington is that there was a feeling, more than a feeling, there were diplomatic negotiations and a plan to try to resolve this diplomatically. So to get to 1701 terms, again, to push Hezbollah from the border, to get the LAF, the Lebanese Armed Forces in, to get economic assistance to the south. The French were involved in this. But Israel had to agree to a ceasefire in Gaza. Who knows if Sinwar would have. But Gaza had to end. There had to be a ceasefire there to even have Hezbollah contemplate this deal. But there was possibly a deal in the north that could have possibly avoided all possibilities, but that was, I think, what the U.S. administration had been pushing for because of this concern of escalation with Iran, among other things, and no one in the region wants this. But Netanyahu does not, there's a big debate about his views on Gaza, but basically the idea is, he doesn't want to pay that price. And so the turn to the front is happening without the price being paid in Gaza. So that hasn't been solved, but now we have the second front, and that is extremely worrying. And just one last repercussion of a second front, because it's not just a question of unintended consequences, there are unintended consequences, but we do need to acknowledge the threat of Iran changing its calculations as well. In the midst of this, because if it becomes an existential issue in terms of Hezbollah's survival, depending on how this second front is unfolding, I've heard Israeli security analysts talk about how their concerns about Iran weaponizing its program have heightened in the last months because they are concerned that Iran no longer views its conventional deterrence as sufficient. And if Hezbollah is one of its most important deterrent factors, as the others mentioned. So, in fact, Iran could have a higher incentive now than ever to weaponize. I'm not saying they're close, but they are a threshold state. It's all about whether they make the decision. So that's something else to be thinking about on this second front in terms of how this unfolds.
So, please go ahead.
A two-finger intervention, because I'm glad that Shai introduced the 1982 issue, because I got to Jerusalem in 1998, and I can tell you that in the election of 1999 in Israel, the number one issue was how to get out of southern Lebanon, because the Israelis were taking casualties every single day in South Lebanon. And when Ehud Barak won that election and came into office, the Palestinians had thought that he was going to be the resurrection of Yitzhak Rabin, and that he was going to renew the negotiations and renew the dialogue with them. When Barak got into office, his number one priority was figuring out how to get out of Lebanon, beginning first with the negotiation with Hafez al-Assad. When that failed, basically he ended up just leaving. And people who think that they can just go into South Lebanon without paying any price are living in a dream world, because it will be ugly if they try to replicate what they did 40 years ago.
By the way, I completely agree with that. But what does it also prove? It also proved that public opinion is not an impediment. In fact, the one main reason why Barak got elected in 1996 is because he promised to take Israel out of Lebanon. He got elected, and he actually delivered. Yes. So, I mean, so yes, sometimes leaders make decisions for the people, just like Sadat did in 1979.
Yeah. And then he lost 2 years later.
For other reasons.
But that's a perfect opportunity to answer the following question, because if you do a quick survey of the Palestinians and in Israeli society, only about 25 to 30% of Palestinians want to move forward with a two-state solution. I believe the Peace Index also indicates that, across the past 3 decades, less and less Israelis prefer the two-state solution. The Israeli Knesset voted against the two-state solution right before Bibi Netanyahu went to address Congress. And so, if we ignore where public opinion is, then what is the missing factor here? It's the political will to move forward with the vision that the United States and other members in the international community have endorsed for decades. Will we see that happening after Gaza, after Lebanon? You go first. You want to go first.
Houston, we have a situation.
There you go.
And the reason we have a situation is because people are usually following or trying to analyze or trying to assess how does the public distribute between, let's call it, hawks and doves. Although when I was a soldier 50 years ago, Israel had a chief of staff, his name was General Bar-Lev, who had the reputation of speaking very slowly, and one day an American television crew stuck a microphone in his mouth and said, "General Bar-Lev, are you a hawk or a dove?" He spoke very slowly, as I said. He said, "I am not a hawk, and I am not a dove, and I'm certainly not a sitting duck." So now, going to the serious. So there is this issue of, how flexible people are, how conciliatory people are, and so on and so on. But what people don't pay attention to the fact that parallel to this continuum from hawks to dove, there's also a continuum between optimists and pessimists. My own view is that right now, the big problem we have is not so much the hawk-dove issue, it's how pessimistic everybody is about the ability to do something about this conflict. This sometimes is exactly where leadership is required, okay? And I can understand, but by the way, when you talk about Palestinians and ask them, which I did on more than one occasion, we know we have to ask Palestinians, we have to ask taxi drivers, but the best is to ask Palestinian taxi drivers. And when I ask Palestinian taxi drivers, what do they think? The last national security assessment that I got from a Palestinian taxi driver is, with the leadership that you have, you as me, Israeli, and we Palestinians,
It will not happen.
no chance. So yes, we are in a period in this conflict. We were in worse situations, but or not worse situations, but let's say I lived through the immediate post-73 war. The difference between then and now is that we had the leadership to deal with. We had an Israeli leadership. Golda Meir gave the torch to Rabin. We had Sadat on the Egyptian side and so on. Right now, it's very hard to see how you get out of this because there are no local leaders, which is Israeli Palestinians and so on, that are willing to sign on. And there's no architect, as was post-73. We had Henry Kissinger, supported by Richard Nixon, who backed him to be the architect of how to get from point A to point B. We don't have this right now.
Ambassador.
Yeah, I think that's right. I would have to say that that the number one priority needs to be new leadership in both Jerusalem and Ramallah. and that you're not going to really see progress on resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict until you have leaders in both of those places who are both willing and
You mean
able.
Jerusalem and Ramallah?
Yeah, that's what I said.
I thought you said Amman. No,
No. We love the king. Yeah. No. So no. Jerusalem and Ramallah. You need new, fresh leadership, political leadership, leaders who actually have popular support in the Palestinian territories. You need leaders in Israel. I think that when somebody says what their intent is, you should take them seriously. Bibi Netanyahu has been very clear in saying that his intent is never to permit the establishment of an independent Palestinian state. We should believe him in that, and therefore I think that from a U.S. national security perspective, he is not a partner that we can work with or we should work with, and so. The other thing, and I think again the first panel made this point as well, and that is that what October 7th and the aftermath have demonstrated is that this is not an Israeli-Palestinian issue. It is a global issue. It is an issue that threatens the security and the peace and stability of the region and even beyond that of the entire world. And therefore, the international community can't sit back and say it's up to Israelis and Palestinians to make these decisions, and that the old Jim Baker line about we can't want peace more than the parties. Mm-hmm. Well, in fact, we actually do need to want peace more than the parties, and we need to be willing to press, not only not only on our own, but as part of a larger international approach. We need to be very clear in saying that the time has come that we can no longer sit back and watch this situation. We have two parties that for 75 years have believed that they can win, and I agree with the earlier comment about people who talk about peace as meaning peace with victory. That we can't, that they have thought that they could win the argument through violence, through the use of military force or terrorism or whatever it is. And for 75 years they failed. Situation has gotten worse. The results of the failure have become more lethal, more threatening. It will continue in that direction unless and until the international community, and here I mean especially our friends in the Gulf and elsewhere in the Arab world, along with ourselves and others, to really press hard for a resolution.
Dalia, any comments there?
I would endorse all of the ambassador's comments. Just to say that I think one of the dilemmas we have right now is we do have leaders with vision. I think the earlier panel said there's no vision, there's alternative. But unfortunately, some of the current leadership on both sides, certainly Hamas and the current government in Israel, which is, let's face it, there's a reason for pessimism. I want to be optimistic. I'm usually optimistic, but it's the most extremist government in Israel we've ever seen. It's difficult to have an ally ruled by people like this, by ministers who are talking about extremist expulsion kinds of statements and policies, and you're hearing more and more talk in Israel in polite settings. Maybe they can go to Jordan. Maybe we can get. This is very difficult situation. This isn't necessarily the mainstream, but we have an extremist government in Israel. We have a maximalist extremist leadership in the Palestinians, represented by Hamas, a failing, illegitimate Palestinian Authority. We need new leaders. The problem is the leaders we have, they have vision, they have a maximalist vision. Mm-hmm. And it's not the vision of peace, prosperity, and integration that we're trying to push. It's a vision of we will take the land that belongs to us, and peace is victory. I think that was a very apt point. So this is what we're up against. This is what we need to create. A better, not just a vision, because narratives are nice, but we need to create some realities on the ground. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Because the pessimism isn't just made up in our heads. It's because when you have a situation of continued expansion of settlements, of provocation in Jerusalem, of claims to the territory, and this goes both ways, There are facts on the ground that are going to be very difficult to reverse, very difficult, if not impossible. And so we need to come up with vision that counters this, but also plans that actually create realities on the ground that look different.
More of a reason to, I guess, heed the advice from the Manama Declaration that even in the midst of this very intense war, the 22 members of the Arab League still reinforced the Arab Peace Initiative. So I think it's very telling about where the leaders want to go. So we have about 40 minutes for the questions that came through, so I'm gonna read a few of them. So the first one, from the discussions today, it seems that achieving peace is more dependent on political will of leaders. We kind of just talked about that, than the might of militaries. What is needed to change the political will of leaders? Or is it about changing the leaders themselves at this point?
Yeah, I
Who
think
wants
it's,
to talk about
as I think we've just discussed, I think it means new leadership in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It means new leaders who are willing to make the kinds of concessions, the kinds of agreements that need to be made in order to move forward. And I think that it also requires, to be honest, again, it needs to be an international approach. It can't simply be the U.S. Continuing to control the negotiations, because we have demonstrated that we also cannot lead that kind of process. We need others in the international community. And again, I think that the Emiratis, the Saudis, the Bahrainis, Moroccans can certainly play an important role in trying to drive an international approach to resolving the conflict. And frankly speaking, I think that they actually do have the leadership that you would want to see, who could come up with something meaningful. And the Abraham Accords perhaps help build the kind of trust that is required on both the Palestinian and the Israeli sides.
And perhaps we can add both Egypt and Jordan.
Egypt and Jordan
absolutely
also should also be in the mix. Absolutely.
Okay, I'll move on to the next question. I think Shai, you're best suited to answer this question. If Israel decides to open another front in the north, it already has, what would deter Palestinian Islamic Jihad and others, Hamas, in the West Bank to open a third front via an intifada there?
I don't actually understand what this means, to open fronts. There
You
is a
believe
front
there's
in,
already
there
a
is a
front?
front in the south. There is a front in the north. There is real fighting in the north. And this is, again, it's the difference between, sometimes between not fighting and fighting. It makes a big, 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 big difference. There was, again, some discussion in the previous panel about how the 2006 war ended. As I said, it ended with 1701. That's less important than the fact that until Nasrallah decided to express his empathy and sympathy with Hamas in the aftermath of this October 7 of last year, we had 70 years of quiet in the north. The Israeli north was thriving. You couldn't get a room in a hotel because it was a flourishing tourist agency. And you know, tourists are the most sensitive to stability or instability.
Correct.
So we had 17 years since 2007 until 2023. That's huge. Now it's a war. It's not a war between wars. It's a war.
Mm-hmm.
It's a war within certain boundaries. That happens. There is something called deterrence within a war, and there is mutual deterrence within a war. And these are red lines that can be easily crossed. So, and in the West Bank, we have a big problem because Hamas is under huge, huge pressure in the south, is trying to ignite the West Bank. And of course, also true, we've got some, sorry for the social science expression, we've got some nutcases on the Israeli side in the West Bank.
You're referring to the
real
settlers?
Religious fanatics that are trying to make the whole place explode. So in this case, the Islamist fanatics on the Arab side and the Jewish fanatics on the Jewish side, they're wonderful partners.
Unfortunately. Okay, so to the next question, and we've talked about the Palestinian Authority and the need to empower and strengthen the Palestinian Authority. So Dalia, if you can answer this question. Isn't the current Israeli government weakening the PA even further at a time when it needs to be revitalized?
I think yes, the short answer. This isn't new. Netanyahu has had a strategy for years to weaken Palestinian nationalism, and the PA specifically. This was part of the plan of dividing the West Bank and Gaza, and indirectly through the Qataris actually funding Hamas, because it was a containment strategy. Now, I don't think any Israeli leader, not just Netanyahu, and no Israeli leader wants to go back to the status quo, right? So containment is no longer an option, whether it's in the south, whether it's in the north. This is why Israel's going for broke. I mean, this is really an existential feeling in Israel at the moment. This was very traumatic. So I think there is a sense, and this is part of the dilemma, is that the population, there's a lot of division over how to deal with the hostages. There's division over the judicial issue. There's not as much division about a Palestinian state or Palestinian aspirations. The polling in Israel shows majority of the population is opposing a two-state solution. Mm-hmm. So this is an area that I think we're going to have a shift in views, both at leadership and popular levels. And that will take a Palestinian leadership that looks credible. And this is going to take this could take a long time, especially after the trauma each side has faced after this year of horrific war. But I think the short answer is yes, he is, undermining the ability of a viable Palestinian governing authority, whether it's the PA or something else. Enabling and facilitating the continuation of West Bank settlements weakens the ability of any independent Palestinian leadership to have legitimacy and the ability to show they are leading their people to an outcome of independence.
Thank you. And
I'll just add to that a small memory, which is that right until the eve of signing the Oslo Accords, the PLO was considered by a majority of Israelis a terrorist organization.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, there's a question that we can also maybe attempt to answer, which is how do you incorporate Hamas into governance? Because the Chinese brokered intra-Palestinian talks, Hamas was present. When you talk to other Arab governments, they still see Hamas political party as part of that.
Yeah, but these same Arab countries have conducted one effort after the other to achieve domestic reconciliation among the Palestinians. Mm-hmm. How many times the Saudis tried? How many times the Egyptians tried? They all failed. Mm-hmm. They all failed because for Hamas leadership to construct a mini state led by Hamas in Gaza was more important than to reconcile the PA and Fatah and so on and so forth, and to present Israel with one address rather than two addresses. Mm-hmm. It was never a two-state solution. As long as Hamas was there, it was at best a three-state solution. And by the way, this idea of the American diplomatic efforts to solve the North, there was never, ever a deal on the North, which was just a deal on the North. Because Nasrallah was very consistent about his position. He is not going to stop before the fire in Gaza stops.
Right.
So there was never a deal regarding Lebanon that was independent of achieving some kind of stability in the south.
There was no deal, but there were attempts at a deal.
I think I said that, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There had to be a ceasebire in Gaza for Hezbollah to consider
yes,
it. Yeah.
Absolutely. So
we should also be honest in making the point that by Bibi Netanyahu's own assertion, they supported Hamas because for the precise reason that they did not want a unified Palestinian entity that would force them to negotiate.
Right.
right? So the Israelis were equally anxious to make sure that Hamas and the PA never reached any kind of an agreement.
See what you did? Again, what you said about Netanyahu is 100% accurate, and then you said the Israelis.
Okay, fair enough.
Because
Fair
this
enough.
is exactly one of the points regarding which it's not just opposition. This is one of the points regarding which we have lived now through a very deep disagreement between what some people call the chieftains of the Israeli defense community and the prime minister.
Right. No, you're right.
So I want to stick to the PA theme. There's another question on it, but specifically whether the release of Marwan Barghouti, who, as a reminder again to the audience, is in Israeli prison, be a good step towards empowering or revitalizing the Palestinian Authority, and what steps could the United States and the Abraham Accord partners take to reform the PA? We kind of touched upon that a little bit earlier, but not so much whether they should, but how. I'll go to you first, Ambassador.
Yeah, it's interesting because, this subject of Marwan Barghouti has come up before. My own thought is that, given that most Palestinians are, below the age of, certainly below the age of 25 or whatever, and Barghouti has been in prison for about that long, if not longer, that most Palestinians don't know him, and whether or not they, would still feel the same kind of interest or that he would still have the same resonance for the majority of Palestinians, I don't know. But I do believe that polling has demonstrated or suggested that he still is seen as a unifying figure within the Palestinian society, and that releasing him would be important. And again, I think that unfortunately the Palestinians, and this is Abu Mazen's strategy, have continued to turn to technocrats. When he's been pressured to appoint prime ministers, he appoints people who really have no political standing and therefore are no political threat to him. And we need to get beyond that. We need a unifying political figure in the Palestinian Authority that can actually negotiate and make agreements. And Barghouti may be that person, I don't know.
Dalia, what do you have to say about Barghouti? I'll get back to you, Shai.
I'm not going to, I think that's well said on the personality front, but I think from the U.S. perspective, I think we need to start reversing some of the trends that started in the Trump administration. It was interesting, the Biden administration kind of rhetorically changed tunes, but in concrete terms didn't change that much. I mean, yes, they started resuming funding to the PA and to UNRWA, which now is suspended again. But the embassy's not going to move. Once that's moved, it's moved. But for example, reopening the consulate in East Jerusalem for the Palestinians, a U.S. diplomatic presence, that was something that many thought the Biden administration would do, and it has not been done. So we need to think about, structural, regardless of the personalities, having some structural, institutional vehicles for Israeli-Palestinian engagement that starts making it seem, and not just seem, but in reality, a sense that the U.S. is supporting an independent Palestinian state, and it's not just rhetoric.
Shai, would you like to add something?
I would just remind Dalia that the consulate in Jerusalem existed until the Trump administration.
Yeah, right, that's my point.
No, I know, but we didn't have peace.
I'm not giving a solution for peace with the consulate. We're talking about the answer to Marissa's question.
Well, I would just add to what Ambassador Feldstein said, that yes, I think Marwan Barghouti has been a kind of a criticism-free because he's been in jail. So it's all kind of a guess as to, I mean, it's very nice to think that the Palestinians have their own Mandela, but there's no real evidence. And if you ask the UAE, they would rather have Mohammed Dahlan. And if you ask Princeton, New Jersey, they would have Salam Fayyad. So there are few candidates for the cabinet.
Very few. That's part of the challenge. So we have a very interesting question that came from the audience about whether there are arguments for or against direct involvement in Lebanese political affairs, covert/overt, given that domestic support for Hezbollah is at an all-time low, which is true. The latest Arab Barometer survey showcased less than 30% support. And is there an opportunity there?
For the U.S.
To do what?
To interfere
To
in
interfere in-
Lebanese
Oh, to
politics.
interfere. That depends what kind of interference you're talking about, yeah.
Well, we've been there,
luck.
we've done that. It's been a disaster every time.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay, that answers
Can
the
I just
question.
add, I
Sure.
think I agree with that, but I think we could positively interfere, then maybe we don't call it interfere anymore, but, and this is something U.S. has done for a long time, our U.S. military here in CENTCOM, supportive of these kinds of initiatives to support the Lebanese armed forces. Central institutions of the state should be bolstered. And part of the plan that the French and the U.S. Biden administration has been putting forward to try to resolve the Northern Front has been, including in the packages, not just pushing Hezbollah back to the north of Litani, which was in 1701, but also increasing support for the LAF. Lebanese armed forces. So that's something we could do in a positive.
And I guess the last question before we turn to closing remarks, can the Abraham Accords be leveraged to influence the Houthis to stop warring on Israel and putting the maritime traffic at risk?
No.
Okay.
I didn't
Can the Abraham Accords be leveraged to influence the Houthis in Yemen? No.
I agree with the ambassador.
Okay. That's very short answer, which gives us time for another question because we have a few of them here. The
biggest problem you see with the Houthis, the biggest strategic surprise regarding the Houthis is, you have to think about who is actually paying the highest price for what the Houthis are doing, and that's Egypt. And
Yes,
you
it's
would have
significantly
expected
impacted their economy.
a more active Egyptian diplomacy to gather the Arab countries around it to together deal with this threat. And frankly, I haven't seen evidence of that.
No, there's no evidence, and I think it goes back to one of the points that we made early on, and that is that all of these states, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the others, but especially Egypt, because you're absolutely right, are reluctant to do anything that is seen as criticism of the Houthi attacks, because the Houthis are doing something that their populations support, which is standing up for the Palestinians. Now, you can agree or disagree with whether or not, the Houthis are actually doing that, but the rhetoric is there, and it's widely seen. So in fact, the Houthis have been successful not only in building popular support domestically, because most Yemenis are extremely sympathetic to the Palestinians, but even more broadly in the region, there is popular support, and therefore none of these states, and it goes back, I didn't mean to be flip in my answer, none of these states is really willing to pressure the Houthis because their streets won't tolerate it. And this is the reality. Now, the dynamic changes. If there's a ceasefire in Gaza, the dynamic changes, and I think that you will see the willingness of the Egyptians and the Saudis and the Emiratis to do more to support us in pressuring the Houthis to stop. But as long as they can wrap the Palestinian flag around themselves, nobody's going to do anything.
So let's go to just brief concluding remarks. If you had 5 minutes with President Biden, we know that there's no hope for a ceasefire. We've been seeing statements by U.S. officials that it doesn't look like it's going to happen. But if you had 5 minutes with President Biden, what would you prioritize in that meeting to highlight?
Am I going
Let's-
first? Or
let's
you
start
want
with
Dalia?
Dalia.
Yeah, Dalia. Yeah.
Well, I would prioritize ending the war in Gaza and getting the hostages out, which he's been trying to do, but probably use a little bit more levers. And agree with the ambassador, we need more of an international approach here. I would say let's focus less on the flashy peace deal signings and focus more on the hard work on the ground, behind the scenes, using our partners, leveraging this regional interest in stability to our favor. And it doesn't have to mean it's a peace deal. You know, the Qataris have been doing a lot with the Israelis directly, interestingly, without normalization. So let's focus, let's right-size the normalization, use it, but leverage things more quietly. And then finally, I would say we need to deal with this Iran issue, because the continued friction between Israel and Iran, and the US-Iran directly, is destabilizing the entire region, and no one else in the region wants this, and nor do we. And so that's easier said than done, but I think I would, you know, with the war ending in Gaza, hopefully, and we do have to recognize that we may not have a day after, but hopefully when we do, that we need to get back to the de-escalation arrangements. It's going to be very hard, because with the Iranians' relationship with the Russians, and the missile delivery that is reported to have been sent to Russia, and the war in Ukraine, it's going to be very difficult to change the equation. But I would agree with the earlier comment on the earlier panel, work more on the wedge between Iran and Russia.
Shai.
Since I think any president who will be elected on November 4 or 5? Is going to have a pretty full agenda. I would say of everything that we talked about, the most important is what President Biden also emphasized, which is to strengthen the Palestinian Authority. And I still remember better days also in terms of the US involvement, not necessarily in the peace negotiations, but actually on the ground, trying to do everything possible to help the Palestinian Authority establish itself. I was privileged to have breakfasts every 6 weeks or so with General Keith Dayton, who did an unbelievable job at that time. And I think General Dayton proved that it's possible. And I would not have had these breakfasts if we were not both optimists.
Thank you. Ambassador Feierstein.
Yeah, I would say that I think the thing that Joe Biden can do between now and January 20th is to really lay out the vision in a much clearer and more comprehensive way of the way to go forward. He's referenced it. He's made statements here and there about how he sees the day after, if you will, in Gaza playing out. But I think that what he needs to do right now is assert U.S. leadership in establishing the modus operandi. What are we going to actually do? And maybe, as Dalia suggested, begin to do the hard work of putting some of the basic concepts into some semblance of readiness to move forward when the opportunity arises. It means thinking through some of the challenges. How, if there is going to be an international conference, how does it work? What's the agenda? Who's going to participate? There's a big question, and the earlier panel dealt with this question of great power competition. If there is going to be an international approach to resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you can assume that the Russians are going to want to be at the table. What's our position on that? What's our position on China being at the table? What's our position, perhaps most difficultly, if difficultly is a word, what is our position on Iranian participation? If you want to go big and say, our vision is actually to resolve the big issues of the region, then Iran needs to be there. They need to be at the table. But should Iran be given that opportunity if they still refuse to acknowledge even the legitimacy of the State of Israel? that you can't have it both ways. So, so I think that Biden could use these last 4 or 5 months of his tenure to begin to put in place, to express the vision, to articulate the vision, so that everybody knows where the United States wants to go, and then also to begin the dialogue and the preparations with our partners to make that happen when the time comes.
Thank you. Thank you very much to our esteemed panelists and to all of you for your excellent questions and for listening in. And I'll turn it over to you, Jim. Thank you.